おはようございます。まだ前の方でテーブル席空いております。
満席が予想されております。どうぞお繰り合わせの上お座りください。
おはようございます。まだ前方テーブル席
どうぞ中央のお席まだ空きございます。でも中央のお席まだ空きございます。
前方テーブル席
この後満席が予想されております。満席が予想されております。
おはようございます。
テーブルのお席に限りがございますので、どうぞお繰り合わせの上お座りください。どうぞ中央前方の席まだ空きございます。中央前方の席まだ空きございます。
おはようございます。ただいま前方テーブル席へお座りいただいております。
どうぞ中央前方の席まだ空きございます。中央前方の席まだ空きがございます。テーブルのお席に限りがございますので、できるだけお繰り合わせの上お座りください。どうぞ中央前方まだお席ございます。中央前方まだお席ございます。どうぞご利用ください。本日満席となります。この後満席が予想されております。テーブルの席に限りがございますので、どうぞお繰り合わせの上お座りください。どうぞ中央前方の席まだ空きございます。中央前方の席まだ空きございます。 ど
おはようございます。まだ中央テーブルの
中央前方の席まだ空きがございます。
本日はセキュリティウィーク2017にご来場いただき誠にありがとうございます。 Thank you for coming to the Security Week 2017。 ご来場の皆様にご案内申し上げます。講演中は通信機器をマナーモードに設定の上、通話はご遠慮ください。同時通訳レシーバーをご利用の際はチャンネル、音量をお確かめください。それでは間もなくの開演となります。そのままお席でお待ちください。
まだ空きございます。
テーブルの席まだこちら空きございます。テーブルの席まだ空いております。本日満席、この後満席が予想されております。テーブルの席には限りがございます。どうぞテーブルの席まだ空きございます。テーブルの席まだ空きございます。
レポートテーブルの席をお願いしていただいております。
テーブルの席まだ空いておりますので、テーブルのままでお越しください。こちらにも席まだ空いております。テーブルの席には限りがございます。お繰り合わせのお伝えください。本日この後満席が予想されております。
大変長らくお待たせいたしました。ただいまよりなぜ未だにスパムやフィッシングに悩まされるのか。 Why is there still so much spam and phishing? DMARC オーガナイゼーションエグゼクティブディレクター、リンクドイン E メールシニアシステムズエンジニアスティーブン・ジョーンズ様よりご講演をいただきます。
よろしくお願いします。日本語ができません。But I'm very grateful to the organizers for providing simultaneous translation for this event. And thank you all for coming this morning. Normally, coming from the DMARC.org organization, I'm more used to speaking about email authentication. But the organizers preferred that I speak to you about why there is still so much spam and phishing. I find it is always useful to periodically go back and question your assumptions. Why are we pursuing email authentication? What brought us to the point of implementing email authentication? And this informs why we need to continue that work and how we go about doing it. So, I will talk a little bit about how spam and phishing has developed and changed over the years, which explains why we are having so many difficulties with it now. I will speak a little bit about the interaction between spam, phishing, and email authentication. And then a few comments about recent developments with email authentication and where it will be going in the near future. But to start things off, of course, in this day and age, Google knows everything that there is to know. So my first step is to ask Google, why is there still so much spam? And they came up with several comments, as they do, but one in particular stood out and struck me as very curious. Is Hawaii a massive source of spam emails? What exactly is going on here? Looking a little further, spam musubi. Soka. Wakarimashita. Or spam onigiri. So not spam email, fortunately. However, the spam musubi are delicious if you have the chance. So, what is it that makes spam so compelling? Why do people keep doing it? It's very easy to send the messages. There's almost no cost. It's very easy to impersonate other people so that you are not held responsible for the messages that you have sent and the damage you have caused. It's very difficult to block the messages, and there's very little risk of being prosecuted or jailed when you are finally caught. And it is a reliable generator of revenue. It all comes down to the money in the end, and we'll see how that changes who is responsible for spam over time. So, how did we get to where we are today with spam? I've broken this up into different sections of the development, and it starts off in the 1990s with the rise of the internet in the US and globally. And at first, it is very much something that amateurs are doing. And in fact, one of their earliest products and more savory products is teaching other people how to send spam and make so much money. There was very little protection because the internet was not designed with email security in mind. It was a research project. It was not intended to think about security concerns, consumers, and the crimes that may be committed against them. The other problem driving the revenue side of the equation, many people got these messages and bought them. In fact, you have very high success rates with spam in this period. You had people commonly claiming that they would make $25,000 US per month, which is a very respectable starting salary for a college graduate in this period. So it's very easy to see why they continued despite all of the complaints. So this is the first period, really driven by self-taught people, amateurs, and so forth. In the larger sense, we have the internet bubble building up and then bursting in 2000. You now have an incredible amount of capacity for internet connections, for data transmission, hosting providers, backbone carriers, all of whom have now lost most of their customer base and are then seeing shortfalls in revenue. Interestingly, despite this, into the early 2000s, people still felt that it was a very small number of people, the amateurs that got involved in the 1990s, that were responsible for sending most of these messages. But the conditions have now changed, and spam is going to change as a result. So this is what I think of as the second wave, where you see innovation, new approaches coming from spammers, partly because criminals start to get involved, professional criminals, organized crime gets involved. You start to see some hosting operations that make defying legal authorities and warrants part of the service they provide to the spammers, to the spam operators. And so the bulletproof hosting that we see there is part of this. You also see viruses being transmitted over the internet as opposed to over shareware and other resources. And eventually these things combine. You get the spammers and the virus writers realizing that one can work very well with the other. And so you start to see the creation of the earliest botnets, where one machine that is compromised by a virus is then used to send spam, which compromises more machines, which then send more spam, etc., etc. And the volume of messages, as the internet continued to grow, the volume of spam grew dramatically. So in this period, 2006, 2007, 2008, you see a tremendous increase in the number of overall email messages, and then the percentage of those messages that are actually spam. So what else is happening while the spammers are doing these things? We find that there is a large trend continuing with outsourcing of corporate services. Large enterprises, medium enterprises, and other businesses are starting to take operations that had formerly been central to the organization and are farming those out to other companies to provide human resources services, benefits of different kinds, payroll. And the reason this becomes important here is that these third parties are now sending messages on behalf of the companies. They may not be doing it in the same way that the companies do. They use slightly different domain names. They don't implement the authentication features that would help you tell when is a message trustworthy and when is it an imposter. All of this tends to make the employees less certain of what they're looking at. And this only increased as more services became outsourced. And so you have unfortunate events, such as the test that's mentioned here in 2005, right in the middle of this period, where government employees are checked to see if they can distinguish spam or phishing from messages that are legitimate. And 15% actually got to the point where they would have been compromised. They would have given up account details or personal information like their government identifying numbers that basically are success for the criminals. Worse than that, again, it's difficult sometimes to make these determinations, but worse, 2 months after they go through this exercise and are given more training, more explanation of what to look for, half of them still fail the test. It is a very difficult problem to deal with, and it really must be kept in mind that users need to be given as much support as possible to make the correct decision about these things. All of this is not happening in a vacuum. Law enforcement, mailbox providers, and others are actively trying to shut down the new botnets and the other operators that are out there. So a famous case in 2008, the Mancolo data center, which hosted most of the botnet command and control nodes, was shut down, had a very large impact on the amount of spam being sent for a while. And the criminals learned from this. They were harmed. They lost the botnets, they lost revenue, and they were realizing that they were vulnerable to these kinds of attacks in a very real way. And so this leads to some innovation and to them creating more resilient systems for committing their crimes. They learned from peer-to-peer networking, which had also been growing across all of this period, how to distribute control of the botnets. They also wound up distributing their operations. As many governments implemented laws against spam and more people were prosecuted, you finally saw that shift from the amateurs to the professional criminals. Very often, those professional criminals were located in Eastern Europe or other parts of the world that were harder to reach with those laws. So not only are the botnets more resilient and distributed, but so are the criminal operations. They also took more steps to secure the communications between the botnets and secure the information that they had harvested, from their victims. All of that is well and good, but so much effort is required to implement these changes. What was the motivation? Well, it's more than just selling pornography sites or gambling sites or something like that. The ways that you can get economic benefit from compromising PCs are multiplying in this period. There's the information about the consumer that you can steal. There's the access that that consumer may have as an employee of a company that you can leverage, that leads you to penetrate those companies, that leads to data breaches and other situations. You can take over the CPU and perform cryptocurrency mining for a while. That was very popular. And of course, you have ransomware, which is still very much a problem. And in the background, almost the lowest value service, but a constant theme, is more spam, more phishing messages, so that you can recruit more PCs to replace the ones that are rebuilt and disinfected. So maybe over time we've made progress. What does it look like when we ask users, can they identify phishing correctly or not? Well, they think they can identify phishing. Unfortunately, they have received a lot of training. Unfortunately, most of the time they are still making mistakes about whether a message is trustworthy or not. All of the trends that I mentioned with outsourcing are still in operation, are still confusing the issue. Users have still been trained to, if you don't get a message that looks right or that you were expecting in the inbox, go look for it in your spam folder, where all the other dangerous messages are put. That's very unfortunate. So people do very poorly with these tests. In the meantime, crime is paying very well. They're having a lot of success with exploiting the networks of PCs, the account credentials that they're able to steal, being able to place more interesting parts of malware on the PCs that they get translated to their work computers, their laptops. The numbers are staggering, and most of you will have seen the headlines about this already. So, unfortunately, the companies are still sending these messages that look the same. The good news, there are simple ways that you can address this. Many of the practices that would help combat these situations are available. The particular screenshot here are best practices for mailbox providers, but if you are an email sender or an enterprise, you can read these and see the best practices that are recommended that they are looking for to be able to tell the good messages from the bad. And no surprise, a lot of it comes down to email authentication. More importantly, you can do things like manage your clickable links, your URLs as intranet sites, something that I've seen a number of companies do, so that you're no longer sending active links in your email messages to your employees. You either have to type it in or you include it as only an intranet link that would only work from the workplace. The other side is make it very clear to your employees what you will and will not do. We will not send you messages that ask for your passwords or that lead you to forms to fill out account details unless you see X, Y, and Z. It's amazing how effective this can be when it is enforced consistently across all the operations. So, how does spam and email authentication come into play with these things? How do they develop in lockstep? Fundamental to all of the spamming activity is impersonation, starting in the earliest period, because they did not want to have to deal with bounces, the notifications that their message wasn't delivered. They didn't want to have to deal with complaints that they were sending from their accounts. They started impersonating other users. As we continue through time, they want to impersonate other people to avoid the spam filters that have been set up to flag their accounts or their messages, the fingerprinting of messages that are reported to be bad. Finally, and more recently, they want to leverage the trust that you have in a particular brand. So they may be sending a message out that looks like Big Bank, so that you would believe, oh, well, I have an account with that bank. I'll go ahead and open the message and do what it tells me. Through all of this, email authentication has been designed to try and stop them from performing these impersonations in various ways. To try and make it easier and programmatic, to make it automatic to detect when the message is good versus when the message is bad. I won't go into too many details about the protocols. These are the right timelines when they were published. In particular, if you want to learn more about how the protocols are best implemented, how they are effective, I would recommend the IA Japan site as an excellent resource for this. Obviously, there are many others as well. But how does each of these steps forward also represent 2 steps forward and 1 step back? Well, we start with SPF, trying to counter the bounce messages, the backscatter from large sending campaigns, and they were effective with blocking those messages. However, they didn't do anything about the from header in the message and impersonation happening there. SPF itself as a protocol was very complex. It was very easy to misconfigure it, and in fact, through the earliest periods, most often it was misconfigured. All of this resulted in the mailbox providers not having confidence to trust the verdict, the decision of the SPF checks. For many years, it was not possible to get them to block messages that had failed those checks. Some of these limitations lead into the creation of DMARC, where you want to protect the headers of the message, You want to prevent it from being replayed. There's time information and so forth. The problem then becomes there is no accepted policy mechanism that tells you what to do when the message fails that you can check. Also, with the third-party senders that were becoming more and more popular at the same period, this is the mid-2000s, it's very difficult to have a well-understood or clearly deployed policy to handle those outsourced vendors. And each company is doing it a little bit differently. Again, that makes it more difficult to make an automatic decision at the mailbox provider or the enterprise that's receiving messages for their employees. So again, not a perfect solution addressing what had happened, but leaving a gap. We get another protocol, DMARC, which tries to address these. There's a clear policy mechanism. It's from the beginning enforced at the biggest global ISPs or mailbox providers. But again, we find that there is a problem with cousin domains, domains that are carefully crafted to look like a recognizable brand, but substitute one character or two characters. To the casual user, it will look like the right site. They'll use the same logos, the same images, but in fact, it's a bad actor, it's a criminal that is trying to get their confidence and their information. We also found that there were difficulties with DMARC when messages were being forwarded between sites. And very clearly when DMARC was introduced, we started to find out just how common it is for that forwarding to be an important factor for people's customers. This is more of a retrospective. Traditionally, these are the problems that you find with deploying email authentication or with convincing an organization that they have to deploy email authentication. I bring this up because we see more and more often people are starting to ask, why have the companies not deployed these protections? And internally, when it comes to putting together a project team and getting approval from management and executives, it can be very difficult to overcome some of these challenges. Who is responsible across the enterprise for sending email messages, for setting the policy that states what should and should not be done with those messages? And do they have the authority to enforce it across the company, to impose those requirements on their vendors and partners? There are also external factors. My customers don't know about this and aren't asking for it. There is no government agency telling me I need to do this. Again, this was retrospective in the past. There is no penalty for me within my industry if I do not implement these checks. How do I put a dollar figure on reputation issues? Until I suffer a loss, I have no way to put a number on this, and so when I ask for resources to implement these things, it's very difficult to justify sometimes. So, we'll move on to some of the more recent developments happening with email authentication and how this all comes together. We have many reports over the years that talk about, that document the growth in spam and phishing, the threat they represent to companies and to their customers. Finally, in the past few years, we started to have some industry analysts looking at email services, email products or software, and including the email authentication features that will help you implement these policies, protect your employees, and protect your customers. And they finally started incorporating these mechanisms into their stores for the products and services so that you can see, I would be able to do this with this product, I won't be able to do this with this other product. In this period, again, the same time that this change is happening in the industry reports, we see the growth, the introduction and growth of the DMARC protocol. And for several years, it's all about the increasing adoption of that new protocol and what it might be able to do. But in the past year or so, more recently, it starts to focus on the fact that while we see adoption, we don't see overwhelming adoption. It's generally a fairly low percentage when we look at the overall market. And we don't see people implementing the strongest policies that would say definitively do not deliver any of the messages that you detect as being imposters for my domain. And just in the past year, as I say, you see a number of the email security firms that have focused on that lack of the reject policy, that you have not taken the final step, the strongest measure with DMARC. In the meantime, as we all know from our day-to-day lives, from our jobs, there is more and more email-based abuse and crime, and it is more successful. It has generated more revenue. There are more and more articles being published about it in the news as more people suffer from these attacks. And whether you're discussing ransomware or data breach at large companies that hold consumer information, it all seems to start with email. Either the direct infection of the consumer PC was because of email, that's how they got the ransomware or the botnet virus, or with the enterprises, email phishing is how they started to get the credentials for the employee that led them to the VPN connection, that led them into the enterprise network, that let them access the sensitive data that was then released. And the numbers for that have just been staggering over the past 2 years in particular. As industry recognizes the problem, more importantly, as the press and consumers recognize the problem, they start to ask, why have you not taken advantage of these technologies that hold out hope preventing these compromises? Another side of this, I mentioned earlier the external factors. Who is requiring me to implement these changes? What is the penalty if I don't implement these protections? Well, governments are finally starting to move. There were some recommendations early on from a few governments that you should look at these different protection mechanisms. I should say Japan had a very solid experience, a very good experience adopting SPF early on and getting good coverage across the country. As we moved through DKIM and into DMARC, we saw a few governments, when it was first announced, making that recommendation. What I'm most encouraged by is that at the end of last year, the United Kingdom, Britain, made a very clear and very strong national policy that all government agencies would be required to implement DMARC and to use it at the highest level to protect their citizens. That has had a tremendous impact over the past year. I think also that when they look at economic competition between them and other countries in the EU and globally, they recognize that if they can get an early lead in email security, in data security, by putting these kinds of policies in place, it makes them more competitive for offering these services globally. They are able to see economic opportunities for this when they look at business in Germany, in France, other places. And so there is a first mover advantage by trying to lift their entire industry with these policies. After that took place, we saw more activity in the US from different groups, different departments. And finally, I think best of all, the Department of Homeland Security indicated that it would start scanning all of the government agencies in the US to see if they were implementing these protections. Very similar to the policy that the UK had announced back in November of last year. What happens next? What do I see coming up with this? I don't see phishing being solved anytime soon. It will continue to grow. Spam, it's very difficult actually to use these buckets, these labels, because of course a spam message that just tries to sell you something is very rare these days. More often you'll see a spam message trying to sell you something, but it includes a link to a site that will infect your PC. It includes an attachment that will do the same. You see threats in many dimensions for each of the messages coming through. But when you look at the reports, you will see spam growing. You may see phishing. You may see spam starting to decline and phishing growing. Excuse me. I think that we will see more governments recognizing that this is something they need to force industry to adopt to protect their consumers, to protect their citizens, to allow more services to be offered online, which is more efficient, more cost-effective. I mentioned some of the limitations with DMARC in particular. With forwarding, with mailing lists and services like that, there is a new protocol called ARC that will help address those limitations. It's been in development for some time. I've spoken about it previously, but we will finally see free open source implementations of it being announced, I think being released in October of this year. An open ARC implementation will be available. So that does two things. It's a free software option that is available for people to implement, but we will see several vendors incorporating that into their commercial products. So if you don't have the expertise on staff to implement something like that yourself, more importantly, you will have vendor-supported options that will implement that code and make those features available to you for protecting your employees, your customers, and so forth. ARC has been a limiting factor, or rather, the problems with forwarding email and mailing lists have been a factor in global ISPs implementing stronger policies to protect their consumers, their mailbox users. There is something referred to as no authentication, no entry. That is, when an operator like Google looks at an email message, if it does not have some form of email authentication, it's going to be treated very, very suspiciously. It's not impossible for it to get through, but it is going to go through a lot more analysis than a message that has one of those mechanisms. Any kind of delay in delivering your message as an email marketer or in terms of providing service to your customers is an impact to your business, is an impact to your revenue. So this becomes very important. As ARC becomes common, Google and other providers are going to resume their push to say you must have authentication for you to be delivering your messages in a timely fashion to consumers. And this again becomes very important to overall adoption. This provides the impetus. Why should my company be implementing these things? If you want good deliverability, you had better implement that. I think we'll also see more activity similar to what JIPTech has done with, forgive me if I get this wrong, the trust mark or passmark. I know that has been very successful here, and I think we will see more features like this being introduced globally, whether it's the US or Europe or other markets, built on top of different authentication mechanisms. So again, unless you have implemented SPF and DKIM and DMARC, those trust marks, those features are not going to be available to you in all the markets that you want to operate in. The last slide, just a couple of predictions for that. I expect that DMARC adoption is going to continue to increase. I apologize for not having slides about adoption and different metrics for tracking this in the marketplace. I hope to have that the next time I'm in town. But we will continue to see the adoption increase year over year through the end of 2017. I expect to see that rate of increase itself through 2018. So, I don't think we wanted to have any questions for this. But I am available through the rest of the day if you do have questions that you would like to ask or have any further explanation about different things I mentioned in the talk. I just wanted to say, arigatou gozaimasu.
ご清聴ありがとうございました。次回のセッション、計算の